Across to Mr. Ashley J Tellis. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the Tata chair at Carnegie. Thank you very much, Mr. Tellis, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. So I said three strikes when I described what's been happening between India and the United States. The trade and tariffs one was the first strike, where India was the only country in the world, along with Brazil, to be tariffed at 50%. India is the only country to be tariffed for import of Russian oil. Then you had this sanctions waiver for the Chabahar port, which Trump incidentally had given in his first term. That's been waived off last week. And then on Friday, we had this big, almost some would say body blow to Indian techies in the form of the H-1B announcement. How does India read this? How does India navigate these curve balls that the Trump administration is throwing at it?
So I would caution against seeing this as some kind of a cumulative strategy aimed only at India. I think each of the three elements that you flagged have their own logic, though obviously India is clearly affected by the accumulation of them. I think the H-1B visa, for example, that's been a concern that this administration came into office with this time around. It was almost inevitable that there was going to be some pushback on the H-1B program. The issues relating to Iran are also connected to the changes in US policy towards Iran, most recently the attacks that took place, and the Trump administration's desire to essentially short-circuit any Iranian ambitions towards a nuclear weapon. And even the trade problems that we've had with India are linked to the trade problems we seem to be having with every country around the world. So India is uniquely affected by this trifecta, but it's not designed to be the sole target of US policies.
But the cumulative factor, as you said, one after another, one adding up after another, that's left a bit of a, not just a bitter taste in the mouth here in India, but policymakers is really sort of confounded. How does one deal with this? Because it seems like, on the face of it, India and the US are strategic partners. There's a strategic logic to it. It's been there for the last 25 years. But in the matter of 2 or 3 months now, the very logic of that strategic partnership has been upended. So how does India respond to it?
Well, I think India ought to respond in exactly the way that it's doing, which is you separate each of these elements and you address the concerns embodied in each element seriously. And I think India has already begun to do that. But it's the last point that you make that I think needs to be, sort of taken more seriously, which is that the strategic foundations of the relationship have indeed been upended. Because those strategic foundations were erected on the assumption that China would be a persistent strategic competitor to the United States. And in that context, India, of course, had outsized importance. But for the second Trump administration, China is seen entirely as an economic rival rather than as a geopolitical competitor. And all countries in the world are seen as economic rivals of the United States. So in that context, the kind of primacy that India enjoyed in US foreign policy making has certainly diminished considerably. And I think that is the transformative fact that we need to wrap our hands around.
So let me just deal with that China question, because, again, the way New Delhi sees it, the actions that have been taken by the Trump administration in the last few weeks vis-a-vis China, you have this TikTok deal that prior to that, China got this exemption for 3 months. They decided to, not have the tariffs on China for 3 months. I think it was the only country that got such a large window. Second, you had this TikTok deal, which both the presidents spoke over the phone last weekend, and, that seems to have been negotiated. And now, even President Trump saying that he'll likely meet President Xi Jinping maybe as early as next month on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Korea. And the fear here in India is that the US-China trade deal might get cut. A deal might be done between Beijing and Washington before a deal between Delhi and Washington, and therefore India might be left out in the lurch.
So I think we have to take two elements quite seriously, right? That from President Trump's point of view, he is eager, in fact, some might say desperately eager, for a trade deal with China, which, if it were to happen, could have the potential of making all US-China problems go away, at least from the president's perspective. And I think that is a dangerous expectation, even for the United States. But it doesn't matter what I think on this count. I mean, what matters is what President Trump thinks. And he seems to believe that if we can get a negotiated settlement of the problems that bedevil the United States and China on trade, then China just ceases to become a strategic competitor. And if that is in fact the premise on which he's operating, then I think both the United States and in India are going to be in substantial trouble. The second issue, of course, has to do with sequencing. I know the president wants a agreement with China very quickly. I think the challenges with China are quite serious. I'm not sure that we will be able to reach that agreement prior to reaching the agreement with India. Uh, I think that's something we have to simply wait and watch for.
Okay, let me just press you on that a bit. So if you're saying that in Trump's worldview, and frankly he's the only person who matters because he can decide on a whim what policy is. If in Trump's worldview the only thing that is sort of the point of contention between the US and China is on trade, and he doesn't view China as a strategic competitor, what happens to US allies like Japan and South Korea and Philippines? And then there's this whole Taiwan question. So is he then basically saying to Xi Jinping, I don't care what you do there, it's your backyard, you can do what you want?
Well, that is certainly the implication that all American allies fear most of all. So he sees China as a trade competitor. He, of course, sees China as a broader economic competitor, a competitor in innovation, and so on and so forth. But I do not get the impression that in this second term, he sees China as a geopolitical competitor and that he sees China's policies as undermining US primacy, for example, in the Indo Pacific, or in the US status as a global hegemon. I just don't see that as being visible enough in his second term. Now, to be fair, his administration seems to have a somewhat different view. His administration understands that China is both an economic competitor and a strategic competitor. But to the degree that the president does not share that conviction, it certainly complicates US relations with its friends and allies, as the Japanese have, sort of understood and learned firsthand in the last few months, as the Koreans have learned firsthand in the last few months, and as India has learned in the last few months. So this is a problem that is likely to persist for some time to come.
So if I were to look at it another way, and some people have written about this, I think there's been some work around this as well, that in Trump's head, the world is like it was between 1918 and 1939, between the two world wars, where you had different countries and different spheres of influence. So you had the Anglo-Saxon sphere of influence, you had the Russian sphere of influence, you had America, which was unchallenged on either side, on either ocean, as it were. And now, of course, he's trying to replicate that to the 21st century. So China has its own sphere of influence, Russia has its own sphere of influence, America does, and he doesn't really care about the rest of the world.
I think there is a huge element of truth to that his focus appears to be on the United States in its own hemisphere. And to the degree that America has inherited alliances and partnerships, he really sees this as a residual of a different world that he is not quite enthusiastic about. Now, having said all that, there are the realities of path dependence, right? The United States simply cannot walk away from the obligations that it has inherited, even if the president at the moment is not enthusiastic about them. But what it does risk is a fraying of those traditional relationships. And over the long term, that fraying could be very costly for America's own interests. Once we come around to recognizing them as we did for many decades in the post-war era. So I think what our partners have to do is to really think of their relationships with the United States beyond President Trump. Because if you don't keep that perspective in mind, then you are really going to be buffeted by a lot of surprises, some very unpleasant, in the next 3.5 years.
Well, I was just going to say, what do you do about the next 3.5 years? So I want to bring it back to where I started, and that is the three challenges that have been placed before India. And if you were to put, yourself in the shoes of the Prime Minister of India or the Foreign Minister of India and how to navigate these three. One is the tariffs and trade issue, the 50% tariffs that have been imposed on India. How does India navigate that? Second, like I mentioned, the Chabahar port. Again, the reason why New Delhi is really flipped out about the Chabahar port sanctions being taken off is because, this was an understanding that Trump had in his first term. And nobody else is affected by this other than India, because it's India that operates Chabahar. It's India that wants Chabahar for its connectivity into Central Asia. And it is sort of India's response to Gwadar, which the Chinese and the Pakistanis are building. And thirdly, on this H-1B business, how does India navigate these three, issues that have come up in this relationship?
Well, I will address each of those three, but let me make a foundational point first, right? The second Trump term is radically different from the first Trump term. And the fact that Trump took certain positions in the first term do not bind him for the second term. The clearest case in point is the reality of great power competition. It was Trump who declared the onset of great power competition in his first term. And in the second term, he operates as if he has no memory of what he did in the first. So we need to get that, sort of very clear that this is a different administration from the first term, and you have to take it at face value. On each of the specifics, I fear that the issues relating to Russian oil are going to be the most complicated. I fear that the issues relating to Chabahar are going to be equally complicated. And I don't think there is going to be substantial relief for India on either of those counts. So India has to simply recognize that it is in its own self-interest, if it wants to preserve the relationship with President Trump and with the United States over the next 3 years, to diminish the offtake of oil and to live with the fact that, the relationship on Chabahar is going to have to be one of distance, at least until the US changes its mind. I'm much more optimistic on trade, because I think we will be able to reach an agreement with respect to tariff reductions and a satisfactory trade agreement in the next few months.
And on H-1B?
The H-1B challenge, I think, will sort of take care of itself, but not in a way that India may like, which is I see increasingly American companies not giving up on high talents coming from India, but essentially attempting to use those talents in situ. Outsourcing the work to India so that talented Indians can work on these problems at home rather than having to come on an H-1B visa to the United States. Now, there will be still a certain proportion of Indians who will come on H-1B visas because it's simply economical for US companies to bring them here, but certainly not in the numbers that they have in the past. Most of that work will continue to be done for US companies, but from India and within India.
All right, Mr. Ashley Tellis, thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts and perspective on these pressing issues around the India-US relationship. Thank you very much indeed for your time and your perspective.
A pleasure. Thank you.